Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting history. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story. Alright, welcome to Wayback Wednesday. We're running late. I seem to be doing a lot late this year, but we're working on it. I'll get it out as soon as I can. I'm trying to get back on schedule, but life has been kind of chaotic this year. It's been a real rough year. But before all that, we have a video Joe chose Apollo 11, because why not? He likes space and military stuff. I just give him suggestions. He picks it. That's all I have to tell you. Anyway, so we have a alien race. Are you ready? Here we go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. This shout out is for our friends. Let's see who it is today. All right. Start. All right. There's Nacho Daily. There's Luis. Luisa. There's Dave. There's Linda. There's Day One. Laura. Peach. Garoff. Frugal, Rowdy, Spectral, Jason, Win. There's Sheena, Lillian Bear, Tay Eats, Consume. There's Stab, Big Ben, Aries. Let's see, there's excuse me, got hiccups. Sylvia, Capia, Steph, DG, there's Moon, and Eric, New, let's see, oh, it's going to be close. Is it Dorman? It's going to be Dorman. Hold on, Dorman. All right, this is Dorman, as you can see, and he has a vlog, travel, food, all kinds of fun stuff, as you can see. Lots of different types of food here. He's got 11K subscribers, which is wonderful. Lots and lots of food, lots of fun stuff. And of course, so he's got some lives, which were most of the ones that I catch. And so check him out. Cooking channel, it looks like, included. So like, share, comment. Have a good day. All right. The historian is going to tell you something interesting, and I'm going to pretend to pay attention.
Right after she falls asleep.
It's late. I'm tired, and we've had a long day.
We had a very long day, very wide trip, and we went new places. And half of it didn't work out, but the other half I thought went rather well. But I have to stay tuned to find out what the heck we're talking about. But anyway, today's topic for the history buffs out there, we're going to circle around on the calendar, circle, an event that happened in history regarding July the 16th was the launch of Apollo 11. Now, for the history buffs, Apollo was the fun project that we had worked a lot of numbers to try to get it to successfully work. It was our space race to try to put a man on the moon before the end of the decade, made famous by a promise from John F. Kennedy, and they, made the statement that we chose to go to the moon. And it started out way back in the 50s and the 60s. And what a lot of people look at was that, its birthplace is in the Cold War, because the Soviets had popped off Sputnik, first artificial satellite. It was orbiting, surprised the heck out of everybody, because their fear was that, well, if they could put a satellite up there, what's to stop them from putting up nukes or something other, more nefarious? Well, what they wound up doing was basically it cranked our need for space exploration to a higher gear. We started working with trying to put payloads into space. Interestingly enough, some of our earlier projects were actually former U-2 missiles, where we were trying to figure out how rocket engines would work, sometimes rather spectacularly. And so what wound up happening was President Dwight D. Eisenhower at the time created NASA. And Project Mercury, which was to launch a man into the Earth orbit, the Soviets actually beat us to having the first person into space when cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first astronaut in April 12th, 1961. A month later, Alan Shepard would be the first American to get into space. Interestingly enough, he only did a 15-minute suborbital journey. Give you an idea, that's like doing a slingshot. We're going to shoot you really high up in the air. You're not going to go all the way around the planet, but then you'll come back down and land in the water. Well, since the Soviet Union had higher capacity launch vehicles, Eisenhower's successor, John F. Kennedy, chose among options presented by NASA the challenge beyond the capacity of the existing generations of rocketry so that the U.S. and Soviet Union could be starting from a position of equality. A crewed mission to the moon would serve this purpose. Now, May 25th, 1961, Kennedy addressed the United States Congress on urgent national needs, and this is where the declaration came. He says, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieve the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. We propose to accelerate the development of the appropriate lunar spacecraft. We propose to develop alternate liquid and solid fuel boosters, much larger than any now being developed, until certain which is superior. We propose additional funds for other engine development and for unmanned explorations which are particularly important for one purpose which this nation will never overlook: the survival of the man who makes this daring flight. But in a very real sense, it will not be one man going to the moon. If we make this judgment affirmatively, it will be an entire nation, for all of us must work to put him there. Well, Kennedy would make a second speech in September of 1962 before a crowd of about 40,000 people at Rice University football stadium in Houston. Widely quoted refrain from the middle portion reads as follows: there is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind, and its opportunity for peaceful cooperation may never come again. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? They may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We chose to go to the moon. We chose to go to the moon. We chose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one that we are unwilling to postpone, and one that we intend to win, and the others too. Well, in spite of that, the proposed program faced the opposition by many Americans who dubbed it a boondoggle instead of the boondoggle, by Norbert Werner, a mathematician at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The effort to land a man on the moon already had a name, a Project Apollo. Well, Kennedy met with Nikita Khrushchev, a charming individual from the Soviet Union, the premier. In June 1961, he proposed making the moon landing a joint project, but Khrushchev did not take him up on the offer. Kennedy again would propose a joint expedition to the moon. In a speech to the United Nations General Assembly on September 20th, 1963, my dad's birthday.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of a joint moon mission was abandoned after Kennedy's death. Well, an early and crucial decision was choosing lunar orbit rendezvous over both direct ascent and Earth orbit rendezvous. A space rendezvous is an orbital maneuver in which two spacecraft will navigate through space and meet up. In July of 1962, NASA head James Webb telescope announced that the lunar orbit rendezvous would be used and that the Apollo spacecraft would have three major parts: a command module with a cabin for the three astronauts, and the only part that would return to Earth, the service module, which was supported by a command module with propulsion, electrical power, oxygen, and water, and a lunar module which had two stages: a descent stage for landing on the moon, and a descent stage to place the astronauts back into lunar orbit. This design meant that the spacecraft could be launched by a single Saturn V rocket that was then under development. Now, technologies and techniques were required for Apollo were then developed by Project Gemini. The Apollo project was enabled by NASA's adoption of new advances in the semiconductor device, including metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistors in the interplanetary monitoring platform, and silicon integrated circuit chips in the Apollo guidance computer. So we're just breaking all sorts of boundaries here.
Woo!
Now, the project, sadly, was halted when Apollo 1 suffered a disastrous fire on January 27th, 1967. During this particular episode, pilots Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Robert B. Chaffee died, and the subsequent investigation. Well, in October of 1968, Apollo 7 evaluated the command module in Earth orbit, and in December of Apollo 8, tested it in lunar orbit. March 1969, Apollo 9 put the lunar module through its paces in Earth orbit, and then in May, the Apollo 10 performed what was known as a dress rehearsal in lunar orbit. By July of 1969, all the readiness for the Apollo 11 had taken the final step for the moon. Now, interestingly enough, the Soviet Union appeared to be winning the space race in beating the U.S. to first, but its early lead was overtaken by the U.S. Gemini program and the Soviet failure to develop their N-1 launcher, which would have been comparable to the Saturn V. The Soviets tried to beat the U.S. to return lunar material to the Earth by means of uncrewed probes. On July 13th, 3 days before Apollo 11's launch, the Soviet Union launched Luna 15, which did reach lunar orbit before Apollo 11. However, during the descent process, a malfunction caused Luna 15 to crash into the Mare Crisium about 2 hours before Armstrong and Aldrin took off for the moon to begin their voyage home. The Newfield Radio Astronomy Laboratories radio telescope in England recorded transmission from Luna 15 during its descent. These were released in July of 2009 for the 40th anniversary of Apollo 11. So they got close. Unfortunately, they weren't able to do much.
Oops.
Let's smash into the moon. Now, the preparations, they talk about the Apollo 11 mission was designed by Collins, one of the astronauts, who wanted a symbol for a peaceful lunar landing of the United States. And at Lovell's suggestion, he chose a bald eagle, the national bird, as the symbol. Tom Wilson, a simulator instructor, suggested an olive branch in its beak to represent their peaceful mission. Collins added a lunar background with the Earth in the distance. The sunlight of the image is coming from the wrong direction. Oops. The shadow should have been the lower part of the Earth instead of the left. Aldrin, Armstrong, and Collins decided that the eagle and the moon would be in their natural colors, and decided on a blue and gold border. Armstrong was concerned that the 11 would not be understood by the non-English speakers, so they went for Apollo 11. And they decided not to put their names on the patch, so it would be representative of everyone who had worked towards a lunar landing. An illustrator of the Manned Spacecraft Center did the artwork, which was then sent to NASA officials for approval. Interestingly enough, the design was rejected.
Oh no!
Bob Gilruth, the director of the MSC, felt the talons of the eagle looked too warlike. Oh, heaven forbid.
Oh no!
After some discussion, the olive branch was moved to the talons, and when the Eisenhower dollar coin was released in 1971, the patch design provided the eagle for its reverse side. I've seen those coins. They're pretty cool looking. The design was also used for the smaller Susan B. Anthony dollar unveiled in 1979. Now, here's the fun part for call signs. After the crew of Apollo 11 named their spacecraft Charlie Brown and Snoopy, Assistant Manager for Public Affairs Julian Shire wrote to George Lowe, the manager of Apollo Spacecraft Program Office at MSC, to suggest the Apollo 11 crew be less flippant in naming their craft. The name Snow Cone was used for the command module, and Haystack was used for the lunar module in both internal and external communications during the mission.
Does that make sense, right?
To be honest, Haystack is kind of what the lunar module looks like, because it's got those big spindly legs. Now, the lunar module, interestingly enough, was named Eagle, after the motif, which featured prominently in the mission insignia. At Shear's suggestion, the command module was named Columbia after Columbiad, a giant cannon that launched the spacecraft, also from Florida, in Jules Verne's 1865 novel From the Earth to the Moon. It also referred to Columbia, a historical name in the United States. In Collin's 1976 book, he said Columbia was reference to Christopher Columbus.
Because Columbia and Columbus are the same thing.
Pretty close.
No.
No. Now, interesting is also mementos. Heaven forbid we want to, weigh down the astronauts with interesting items and trinkets. The astronauts had personal preference kits, small bags containing personal items of significance they wanted to take with them on the mission. Now, there were 5 half-pound PPKs were carried on Apollo 11. 3, one for each astronaut, were stowed on Columbia before launch, and 2 on the Eagle. Now, Neil Armstrong PPK contained a piece of wood from the Wright brothers' 1903 Wright Flyer, left propeller, and a piece of fabric from its wing, along with a diamond-studded astronaut pin originally given to Slayton by the widows of the Apollo 1 crew. This pin had been intended to be flown on that mission and given to Slayton afterwards, but following the disastrous launch pad fire and subsequent funerals, the widows gave the pin to Slayton. Armstrong took it with him on Apollo 11. And also NASA would have their fun time with site selection. The board actually came up with a total of 5 different locations of where they wanted to have them land. Sea of Tranquility became the, of course, aforementioned site. Using the Lunar Orbiter Program, its information about surface conditions provided by the Surveyor Program, the best Earthbound telescopes could not resolve features within the resolution Project Apollo required. The landing site had to be close to the lunar equator to minimize the amount of propellant required, clear of obstacles to minimize maneuvering, and flat to simplify the task of landing radar. Scientific value was not a consideration. Areas that appeared promising on photographs taken on Earth were often found to be totally unacceptable. The original requirement was that the site had to be free of craters, had to be relaxed, as no such site was found. Now, there were 5 sites that they considered. Sites 1 and 2 were in the Sea of Tranquility. Site 3 was in the Central Bay, and sites 4 and 5 were in the Oceans of Storms. The final site was based on 7 criteria. Area needed to be smooth with relatively few craters, with approach paths free of large hills, tall cliffs, or deep craters that might confuse the landing radar and cause it to issue incorrect readings, reachable with a minimum amount of propellant, allowing for delays in the launch countdown, providing the Apollo spacecraft with a free return trajectory, one that would allow it to coast around the moon and safely return to Earth without requiring any engine firing should a problem arise on the way to the moon, with good visibility during the landing approach, meaning the sun would be between 7 and 20 degrees behind the land, and a general slope of less than 2 degrees in the landing area. Though the requirement of the sun angle was particularly restrictive, limiting the launch date to just 1 day per month. A landing just after dawn was chosen to limit the temperature extremes the astronauts would experience. The Apollo Site Selection Board selected Site 2 with sites 3 and 5 as backups in the event of the launch being delayed. In May of 1969, Apollo 10's lunar module flew to within 50 kilometers, or 9.3 miles, of Site 2 and reported it was acceptable. Now, the first step decision, let's roll the dice.
Woo!
During the first press conference after the Apollo 11 crew was announced, the first question was, which of you gentlemen would be the first man to step onto the lunar surface? Slayton told the reporter it had not been decided, and Armstrong added that it was not based on individual desire. Open the ship, I gotta get out of here! But one of the first versions of the Egress checklist had the lunar module pilot exit the spacecraft before the commander, which matched what had been done on the Gemini missions, where the commanders had never performed the spacewalk. Reporters wrote in early in 1969 that Aldrin would be the first man to walk on the moon, and Associate Administrator George Mueller told reporters that he would be first as well. Aldrin heard that Armstrong would be the first because Armstrong was a civilian, which made Aldrin livid. Aldrin attempted to persuade other launch module pilots he should be first, but they responded cynically about what they perceived as a lobbying campaign. Attempting to stem interdepartmental conflict, Slayton told Aldrin that Armstrong would be the first since he was the commander. The decision was announced at a press conference on April 14, 1969. Now, for decades, Aldrin believed that the final decision was largely driven by the lunar module's hatch location. Because the astronauts had their spacesuits on and the spacecraft was so small, maneuvering to exit the spacecraft was difficult. The crew tried a simulation in which Aldrin left the spacecraft first, but he damaged the simulator while attempting to egress. While this was enough for mission planners to make their decision, Aldrin and Armstrong were left in the dark on the decision until late spring. Slayton told Armstrong the plan was to have him leave the spacecraft first if he agreed. Armstrong said, yes, that's the way to do it. Well, the media accused Armstrong of exercising his commander's prerogative to exit the spacecraft first. Chris Kraft revealed in his 2001 autobiography that a meeting occurred between Gilruth, Slayton, Lowe, and himself to make sure Aldrin would not be the first to walk on the moon. They argued that the first person to walk on the moon should be like Charles Lindbergh, a calm and quiet person. That made the decision to change the flight plan so the commander was the first to egress from the spacecraft. They had kind of a pissing contest about the whole thing, it sounds like.
Right?
Now, the ascent stage of the LM-5 Eagle arrived at the Kennedy Space Center January 8, 1969, followed by the descent stage 4 days later, and the CSM-107 Columbia on January 23rd. There were several differences between the Eagle and Apollo. Snoopy, Eagle had a VHF radio antenna to facilitate communication with the astronauts during their EVA on the lunar surface, a lighter ascent engine, more thermal protection on the landing gear, and a package of scientific experiments known as the Early Apollo Scientific Experiments Package. The only change in the configuration of the command module was the removal of some insulation from the forward hatch. The CSM was mated on January 29th and moved from the operations and checkout building to the vehicle assembly building on April 14th. Now, the third stage of the Saturn V had arrived on January 18th, followed by the second stage on February 6th. The third stage would arrive on February 20th, and the Saturn V instrument unit on February 27th. Well, at 12:30 on May 20th, the 5,443-ton assembly departed the vehicle assembly building atop the crawler transporter. Bound for the launch pad 39A, part of Launch Complex 39, while Apollo 10 was still on its way to the moon. The countdown test was commenced on June 26th and concluded on July 2nd. The launch complex was floodlit on the night of July 15th when the crawler transporter carried the mobile service structure back to its parking area. In the early hours of the morning, the fuel tanks of the second and fourth stages were filled with liquid hydrogen. Fueling was completed by 3 hours before launch. Launch operations were partially automated, with 43 programs written in the Atoll programming language.
Ah.
Good luck in trying to translate that right now. Slayton roused the crew shortly before 4 a.m. They showered, shaved, and had a traditional pre-flight breakfast of steak and eggs with Slayton and the backup crew. They donned down their spacesuits and began breathing pure oxygen. At 6:30, they headed out to the Launch Complex 39. Hayes entered Columbia about 3 hours and 10 minutes before launch time. Along with the technician, he helped Armstrong into the left-hand couch at 6:54. 5 minutes later, Collins joined him, taking up his position on the right-hand couch. Finally, Aldrin entered, taking the center couch. Hayes left around 2 hours and 10 minutes before launch. The closeout crew sealed the hatch, and the cabin was purged and pressurized. The closeout crew then left the launch complex about an hour before launch time. The countdown became automated at 3 minutes and 20 seconds before launch time. Over 450 personnel were at the consoles in the firing room. Now, an estimated 1 million spectators watched the launch of Apollo 11 from the highways and beaches in the vicinity of the launch site. Dignitaries included the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, General William Westmoreland, 4 cabinet members, 19 state governors, 40 mayors, 60 ambassadors, and 200 congressmen. Vice President Spiro Agnew watched the launch with former President Lyndon B. Johnson and his wife Lady Bird Johnson. Around 3,500 media representatives were present. About 2/3 were from the United States, the rest came from 55 other countries. The launch was televised live in 33 countries, with an estimated 25 million viewers in the United States alone. That was back in 1969.
Right.
That's a lot of freaking people. Now, millions more around the world listened to radio broadcasts. President Richard Nixon viewed the launch from the office of the White House with his NASA liaison officer, Apollo astronaut Frank Borman. Lodging near Cape Canaveral was reported being booked months ahead in advance for the launch by a Florida newspaper. Saturn V AS-506 would launch Apollo 11 on July 16, 1969 at 9:32 Eastern Daylight Time. At 13.2 seconds into the flight, the launch vehicle began to roll into its flight azimuth of 72.058 degrees. Full shutdown of the first stage engines occurred at 2 minutes and 32 seconds into the mission, followed by the separation of the first and the ignition of the second stage engines. The second stage engines would cut off and separate at about 9 minutes and 8 seconds, allowing the first ignition of the Saturn IV-B engine a few seconds later. Apollo 11 would arrive at near circular Earth orbit at an altitude of 100.4 nautical miles by 98.9 nautical miles 12 minutes into its flight. That's really kicking the afterburners in. A second ignition of the S4B engine pushed the spacecraft into a trajectory toward the moon with translunar injection burned at 4:22:13 uniform time clock. About 30 minutes later, with Collins in the left seat and at the controls, the transportation docking and extraction maneuver was performed. This was the separating Columbia from the stage, turning around and grabbing the Eagle, which was still attached. After the LM was extracted, the combined spacecraft headed for the moon, while the rocket stage flew onto a trajectory past the moon. This was done to avoid the third stage colliding with the spacecraft, the Earth, or the moon. A slingshot effect from passing around the moon threw it into an orbit around the sun. I have heard somebody said that they have been able to refine the trajectory that stage still carries to this day. Interestingly enough. But that was all the fun that they had for the 16th of July, 1969. Apollo was on its way to history, flying off to the moon. So, this has been the Bearded Historian for yet another fun-filled week at the Bud Files. We hope you folks have had a fun week, and we will catch you next time. Bye-bye.